Good afternoon, everyone. My name's Allison Omens. I'm Chief Strategy Officer here at Just Capital. We so appreciate you taking time before holidays begin. All of our panelists were just joking how desperate we are for a break. So I hope everyone will have some time, at least away from our phones and tablets and computers, to decompress in this very intense year. But before we begin, we did want to get in one last conversation on a really critical issue that has continued to emerge through 2020 and expect to emerge into 2021. So let me first introduce our panelists and tell you about what the conversation is going to be, and then give you a bit of context before I hand it over to my colleague, Patrick Oakford. So I'll continue with him in the bottom left of your screen. Patrick Oakford is our senior manager at Just Capital and has really been leading our work on contractors over the last couple of years. Teresa Hutson is the Vice President, Deputy General Counsel of Microsoft, and we're really delighted, Teresa, to have you join us and talk about your work. Microsoft's been a real leader on the topic. As well as Tauseef Rahman, who's a partner at Mercer and has been doing his own work and Mercer's work really on this topic over the last couple of years. So there's a lot of really important insights for us to get into it. And then obviously myself, Allison Omens. So just to give you a quick couple of minutes on why Just Capital has been looking into this issue and sort of what we're hoping to dig into today. Just Capital is a nonprofit. We were founded about 6.5, 7 years ago. And what we do, one of the things we do is extensively poll Americans on what they think is important corporate behavior and performance. And the issue that consistently rises to the top for people is how a company treats its workers. And so workers is sort of defined broadly, and over the last couple of years, as we've gotten better at assessing companies on sort of those social issues and worker issues in particular, obviously one of the things that have arisen in our own work, as well as in the broader space, is the role of contracting in corporate America and businesses overall. And we've really tried to understand that, recognizing that we are assessing companies using that polling on how they treat workers, on how a company treats its workers. And so really taking on this issue and looking at both disclosure, how a company talks about its full workforce, full-time, part-time, and a contractor workforce, as well as trying to understand the questions and decision points that companies were making on an operational side of why companies choose contractors, where are those decisions being made, and a number of foundations were also and are also focused on those issues. And so over the last 2 years, we have had a series of conversations with companies about this very decision and sort of recognizing that the trends are really significantly going towards a contracting environment. And that includes certainly sort of the gig economy, but is more fundamentally sort of across industries. And so really wanting to dig into the trends sort of, as I said, overall, but really in industries that aren't talked about as much: hospitality, sort of construction, other environments that may not be as obvious. And so our challenge was sort of to measure this topic and really try to understand and capture what is a company's full workforce and how are they thinking about contractor issues, both on the operational side, on the risk side, on the pay and benefit side, and just their relationship to that part of the workforce. And then obviously COVID happened, as we know, 10 months ago in the pandemic. And really some corporate leadership began to stand out of how companies were thinking about their contractors. And Microsoft, so we're delighted to have Teresa on the line today, really stands out to us an example, both pre-pandemic in terms of paid family leave and ensuring access to other benefits, as well as post-pandemic or during the pandemic and thinking about ensuring that contractors still were being financially supported. And I'll let you obviously talk more about that. So it's really sort of come into the foray in a new way. And as we talk about building more resilient economies and companies, we really want to understand, one, how to measure this issue, and two, its impacts. how it impacts operational decisions, resiliency decisions, reliability moving forward in terms of supply chains, as well as inequality. Obviously, Just Capital is committed to stakeholder capitalism, and there is this sort of increasing conversation around the role of companies in addressing inequality in society overall, as well as within their own companies. So it's very much on our minds as we move into 2021. We'll be continuing to dig into the topic, both within our own research, starting to consider how we assess companies in our sort of core research work on contractors, as in how companies approach their contractor workforce, as well as disclosure. That one of the trends we are seeing from the standards body is starting to expect more disclosure on this topic overall. So if this is an area that you're focused on within your own company, or as a researcher, we obviously invite collaboration moving forward. So please feel free to reach out to us. But with that, I think the introduction is done. So I will hand it over to Patrick to sort of take us through the conversation.
Great. Thanks so much, Allison and Teresa, and Tauseef, thanks again for joining us today. I think we're set up for a great and lively discussion. So I'll just kind of dive in, and Tauseef, we'll start with you. As someone who really works closely on these issues across the market, across industries, it would be great for you to kind of set the stage for us a little more. As Allison said, I think this is a topic that is getting increased attention and awareness in the public and in the media, but sometimes the stories that are really breaking through are perhaps only a sliver of what is really representative of the experience. So could you put into context for us a little bit the size and scope of the contract workforce? So, how prevalent are contract workers at firms, and is this a population that, from your vantage point, is an issue that employers are thinking about and responding to during COVID?
Yeah, happy to, Patrick, and thanks for having me, and thanks for all those on the conversation. So yeah, you asked a couple of important questions. One is how prevalent is the use of contractors, and certainly how has that response been through COVID? Mercer, certainly through COVID, and at the onset did some research in March, right just as the COVID outbreak was hitting the US, and we asked a range of employers across the globe, but I'll share some US data in terms of whether they engage contractors to some extent, and 2/3 said they did, right? And I suspect that number might effectively be higher because organizations don't think of certain folks as contractors because they might have thought of them as outsourced. So if I were to hazard a guess, a vast majority of organizations use contractors to some extent. What was interesting for us to find out and ask is the contractor issue has certainly been something that had been a hot topic prior to COVID hitting, just in terms of the how they're treated, the role they play, but very much so during the pandemic. One of the questions was whether there was any compensation support, right? As facilities closed, as kind of work went away. And we found that the majority of organizations, around 50-55%, were not providing any form of compensation. 15% had provided partial or full compensation. I think the other ones, the balance where it was some form of mixed response. And so I think what it does is, if these figures put into context what I think the general public knows about contractors, right? There's opportunities being a contractor, but there's challenges. And when something like COVID hits, and when so many organizations use contractors so widely, the flexibility benefit comes at a cost of employment and income stability. And that's what we saw really happen as COVID hit. So Patrick, does that help kind of answer and contextualize what we've been seeing in the market just in general?
Absolutely, that's super helpful, and I think for Just really underscores just how much in terms of leadership Microsoft actions have been over the last year on this. Microsoft, for those listening and don't know, has ranked #1 on Just's annual rankings for the last 3 years now. And I think Microsoft's action during COVID, especially as it relates to contractors, really highlights why it continues to top this list. Teresa, as Allison had mentioned in the introduction, Microsoft has taken a lot of leading steps to ensure that the hourly workers of your vendors at your campuses continued to be paid during the pandemic. And I definitely want to dig into why, how that all happened. But since you have really had a front row seat to how Microsoft has been thinking about how it engages its contract workforces, over the last couple of years and longer, your time at Microsoft, I would love if you could tell us a little bit more about Microsoft's journey around this issue, right? How has Microsoft gone from being involved in one of the landmark cases of misclassification to a leader on these issues of COVID in kind of setting a new high bar for this? How was it that Microsoft has moved kind of so quickly?
Well, I wouldn't say it feels so quick, but I do think the fact that we were in the seminal misclassification case, people have, for my entire time at Microsoft, asked me like, how do you guys deal with contractors, because they assume we've got it figured out. We learned some pretty hard lessons through that case. It was 10 years of litigation, the Viscano lawsuit against Microsoft, 10 years of litigation up and down to the circuit courts, and we eventually settled it in 2001 for $100 million, which is, for an employment case, really, really high. That really did mean that we then put in place a lot of infrastructure, because we clearly needed the infrastructure to deal with this, population of workers. How do you engage them? What sort of restrictions do you have? What are your sort of supplier code of conduct restrictions? And then, kind of as we were, particularly once we got a new CEO in Satya, just generally, we became more sort of socially active as a corporation. And that, of course, led us to start thinking about income inequality and the various ways in which we're engaging in our communities. And I think really made us sort of ask ourselves some hard questions about how do you operate within the communities in which you live, and what impacts do you have on the broader communities, and what is our responsibility as a company as we are engaging workers to be responsible and be thoughtful. And so I think that was sort of the journey that led us to a couple of steps that you may want to talk about. But
yeah, and Teresa, it's so great to hear you say that kind of a shift in kind of the leadership and what the values of a company, and really kind of targeting of being a member of a community and prioritizing social responsibility, and having that really disseminate through all of its business decisions. And it sounds like that really was perhaps the driver of some of the changes that were happening specifically around contractors. Can you talk a little bit, like, how does a business balance both a desire to kind of live those values and principles with the very real business challenges and decisions around contractors, right? Presumably those difficulties didn't go away, but rather were perhaps just balanced and considered differently against a desire in charge to be more socially conscious and aware, and kind of take proactive steps to improve outcomes within the community.
Yeah, I mean, I think a couple things. One, we're pretty lucky because we've been successful, and that does give you the opportunity to make sort of big decisions with your money. And so I'll just say that. But I will also say being socially responsible and aware has been good for our business. And so it is kind of connected. And we did see that, we were able to kind of, we were really lucky to have good leadership who understood the importance of reputation beyond sort of just reputation for having good products, but reputation kind of in the world. What is your reputation? How do you think about, everything from climate change to supply chain to corruption risk to how you treat your workers? And it's kind of the very broad-based consideration. But again, I do think there is a reality, just to kind of be acknowledging the business reality, that it is helpful to be a big wealthy company. You do have a little bit more freedom with capital when you're a big wealthy company.
Absolutely. And so it sounds like, in 2015, you were able to use this positive position in the market to start taking some steps for those workers of vendors. And in 2015, for those that aren't familiar, you started requiring vendors to offer paid sick leave for their workers, and then eventually added paid parental leave requirements as well. Can you talk, Teresa, a little bit about what was the impetus for specifically those requirements, right? One could imagine that there could be a number of initial requirements around a vendor that you would pursue. And so why was it paid sick leave and paid parental leave? And then also, what was the implementation process like, both internally and then also in engaging vendors, in asking them and requiring them to start providing these benefits?
Yeah, so I think we sort of dipped our toe in with the paid sick leave, and some of that was sort of thinking about our full-time workforce. It's not good for people to have sick people in the office, and if they are disincentivized, and nothing makes that clearer than a pandemic. That it's better if people stay home when they're sick. It's better for everybody, and so we started looking at that and saying, like, what are the barriers to that, but also what are the ways in which our contract workforce feels really sort of extreme pressure. Like, you have to come to work so you can make your paycheck, and then what does that sort of downstream effect on your life? So that's where we started. I think the parental leave, we had sort of tried this experiment with the sick leave and it worked. And then thought, okay, well, what else can we do? We were really focused and continue to be focused on equity issues, pay equity issues, and opportunity equity issues, so particularly gender equity issues. And so what are some of the barriers to, kind of, we were taking a look at the time at global reports about women in the workforce, and kind of what is the sort of global impact to parenting responsibilities being sort of largely focused with women. And so, our Microsoft provides parental leave for people. And, the wonderful thing, I think, is that men and women take parental leave for, as full-time employees. But this was, one of the sort of unique things in the United States, that we don't have paid parental leave where we do in most countries, most developed countries in the world. And so, thinking about the people who, work on our campus or work on our products or whatever sort of ways in which they're supporting us, this felt like an important next step. And I think ultimately, we'll see where we go with this, but there's potential to kind of advocate for this kind of on a country basis, like on a federal level. Right now, we've got this sort of patchwork approach to it. But this feels like it would be a good thing for the country to give people time off to take care of their babies. And so, we started with the parts we could control, also thinking that might be a good way for us to be in a position to advocate for that later on. In terms of implementation, as you can imagine, it's a big process. Like, these are not things you can undertake lightly. You need really close partnership with your procurement functions, with your suppliers. We had, we had done some of the work with the 10 days of paid sick leave, so we kind of had process in place to roll things out, but we needed to make sure that we had good email addresses. Like, I mean, it's pretty tactical, the stuff we had to do to, like, just make sure. We had to, figure out whether we needed to revise contracts. Do you just put this in your supplier code of conduct? Those are questions that kind of demonstrate how seriously you're taking it too. I mean, we would, I think, to the extent we saw a violation of our supplier code of conduct, we would take action, but we would have the opportunity to take legal action if we put it in the contracts. So we did put it in contracts. That requires a lot of work, right? And we have a lot of suppliers. And so figuring out how to implement that was a project. It's an undertaking. I mean, I think a very worthwhile undertaking, but it's not something, to kind of undertake like, oh, it's Tuesday, let's make this happen on Wednesday,
Absolutely. Can imagine that is quite a lift and a major feat. So kudos and hats off for that. And I'm curious, how was it received with vendors, both kind of initially with the paid sick leave and then also the parental leave? Was this something that vendors were kind of a little grumbly about, or was it on the flip side actually vendors that, curious if some were already doing this and then kind of thankful that it created a level playing field, if you will, right? Especially if I can imagine if contractors are bidding to get something that they may feel like their generous benefit package is actually putting them at a disadvantage to a company that is not providing those benefits. Did you see that dynamic at play at all?
Yeah, I mean, I think it ran the gamut, right? I mean, part of it was we agreed to pay extra. So to sort of support this, because, you know, companies are like, well, this is going to impact our bottom line. We did hear some initial feedback that, you know, some of the suppliers said, well, this is going to make us change our entire benefits policy, right? Because we're not going to just offer it to people who work on Microsoft contracts. And we said, okay. Yeah, we're not going to tell you how to run your internal operation. You know, and I think there were definitely suppliers who were already offering these things. And so, you know, not all of them felt it as a significant change. And I think you're right. There were companies that did feel it as kind of leveling the playing field and saying like, okay, good. This is kind of industry standard for how we deploy, how we treat the workers we deploy.
That's so great. And so kind of all of that, it seems like perhaps really set Microsoft up into a strong position to be able to respond during the early months of COVID to roll out new and additional protections for the workers of your vendors on your campuses, particularly around their financial security. And so as we mentioned at the top of the call, Microsoft announced early on that it would continue to pay for all of the hourly workers of vendors on campuses, despite a lot of those campuses kind of shutting down, and so you didn't need those shuttle bus drivers or the cafe workers. Again, how did this decision come to be? It's perhaps a surprising one in a moment when the economy overall is going down. Companies are facing financial constraints. Why was this decision made, and again, how was it rolled out at Microsoft?
Yeah, so I mean, one, I don't think we expected it to still be going. So I think there's part of that. But I think we have continued to pay the hourly workers who serve our campuses. So that is good. It was in some ways an easier thing to implement because it's just you keep on doing what you were already doing, which is paying on contracts. I think ultimately though, and this has become really clear, I think, in conversations in the Seattle area about kind of the public-private partnership, that we really are all kind of responsible for how our region emerges from this sort of catastrophic event. And so what are the ways in which we can keep people steady? Because, vast situations where people are being kicked out of their apartments or not able to buy groceries or unable to kind of participate in the local economy, none of that is good for any of us who kind of live here. It's one of the things, I sometimes joke that we're kind of like a middle-aged company. We were born in 1975, and it's like one of these things where, like, along the way, you really do realize, and I kind of said this earlier, that what you do in your community matters to your community. And we sort of get involved in a lot of ways, but one of the ways in which we're involved in our community is by paying a lot of people who live in our community. And so kind of holding steady to keep those people feeling steady. And we've tried to do different things to give them work too during the pandemic. So one of the ways in which we've used our cafeteria workers was to box up lunches that we then donated to schools and nonprofits. And so, just sort of thinking creatively about available workers you have to also be a part of your community. But ultimately, it was just a leadership decision, right? Where somebody, Brad Smith literally said, I think we should do this. And we did it, and we have continued to do it. And it is one of those things that makes me really proud to work here. I think the other thing, to the recession point, there are some companies who have done pretty well with video calls and using data centers and technology to engage in every moment of every day, and Microsoft is one of those. And so, there is also that part, like the impact of this is not being felt evenly across different kinds of businesses, obviously, and we are one of the businesses who's been very, very lucky throughout this.
Absolutely, it's so great to see that leadership at Microsoft, and as you said, kind of coming from the top of identifying this is a priority, and when that comes from the top, then where there's a will, there's a way, and so it's so great to see that Microsoft was able to roll that out so swiftly and continue to stand by those commitments. Tauseef, I'd love to pull you back in a little bit in the conversation and provide a couple more reflections. Something that Teresa said, while you're talking about paid sick leave, was really making the connection that, perhaps while we often think of contract workers and employees, separately because they exist on different pages or on different ledgers, but the reality is that they're in the same workplace, right? And so your policies and practices around one absolutely impact the other. As simple and fundamentally as if your contractor comes in with the flu and is sitting next to a full-time employee, your full-time employee is going to get sick, and now all of a sudden your actual employees are out sick. So to see how can and should companies be thinking about uniform either benefits and practices around contractors as an operational business decision, and specifically in the COVID context, I'm curious your thoughts on for a company that perhaps didn't take steps like Microsoft and didn't ensure that their contract workers were continuing to be paid and therefore kind of on standby and ready to come back immediately when campuses do reopen, what risk is that posing to a company's operation when the cafeteria workers aren't perhaps ready, right? And the vendor has to rehire and retrain new workers to support the business operations.
Yeah, happy to, Patrick, and good question. I mean, you're really talking about business resilience here, right? Which is the ability of organizations to kind of bounce back, return to a kind of more normal operating model, and definitely Teresa's point on the impact organizations have on their community and how they're perceived will have downstream implications for how even the vendor community might perceive various organizations and how they might kind of want to go about it. So I think at a very tactical level, Patrick, I know what you're asking. Yes, there's absolutely a business resilience question on will we be ready to scale back up things like security and janitors and whatnot. But I think I want to make the other point is that when folks talk about contractors, I think it's easy to think of things like that. It's like the warehouse worker, it's like the shuttle bus driver. But the reality, Patrick, is there's a lot of what you just described where it's a graphic designer who's on loan who comes in to go work, on a team that, will come in and out. And the impact on not being able to have those sorts of, temps, vendors, contractors seamlessly assist the business will affect your full-time employees, right? So the experience that you're providing, that organizations are providing to their full-time employees are absolutely impacted by their ability to bring on and flex work as needed. One of the other things we're seeing a lot of organizations think through, accelerated by the pandemic, is increased focus on flexibility. And flexibility, of course, I think folks think about it geographically. There's time of day flexibility, but it's really a workforce strategy question as well, in terms of what is the work that can be done by contractors to kind of supplement and augment, and or even vice versa, where you might have full-time employees who are, an alternative to retirement might be to go into contractor status. So then you have the opposite side where you have full-time employees thinking, well, how does my employer treat contractors? Because if that's something I'm considering as an alternative way to continue to be employed and work for this organization, you might not have a good experience. And so it's not just for the good of the community, it's for the good of the full-time employees themselves and how contractors are managed. So
that's super insightful and helpful. And it seems like what you're really highlighting is that there's perhaps still a disconnect between kind of where the reality of the use of contract workers are and where the conversation is, both within companies and how companies are talking about this. I think, as you've pointed out, perhaps historically, this has been a form of an employment relationship that was used for either lower wage workers or work that were like not core to the competencies of a company, but increasingly it's an employment relationship that, or structure rather, that is kind of increasing both the skill ladder and the wage ladder and truly going to the core of the business. And so curious, if does that reality then require companies in your mind to start thinking about how they talk about this publicly? And does it require a much more structured way, similar to how they would have, you know, human capital metrics and disclosures just around their full-time employee, right? Which is an area I think we're seeing significant acceleration around demographic disclosures, pay equity, right? And so if these workforces are increasingly being combined, right, and it's all mixed up, how should a company think about the need for a structure and systems in place to report and talk about that contract workforce?
Yeah, I mean, you raise a couple of good points. One, I think the being combined and mixed up is part of the challenge. I'm sure Teresa can kind of talk to that, but the reality is organizations need to get better at being able to understand the impact in two directions, you know, of the employer on that, you know, contractor workforce, and vice versa, on how reliant some organizations can sometimes be on contractors to, you know, perform work. And Patrick, you said it really well. If it is not a core competency, it's something that comes and goes, then that's fine. But if they become increasingly involved in key operations of the business, then it becomes something where organizations would increasingly want to focus on it. And that's kind of the human capital reporting side that you're talking about. I'll comment on it, which is very important. I'll comment on the employee side, the employee experience side, how different parts of the workforces are treated, you know, has always been an issue. I mean, you could have said the same thing about full-time versus part-time workers, right? But, you know, put contractors aside, right? And then you add on different forms of employment, which is of course the complexity of the issue of, you know, what do you consider kind of employment, full-time, you know, or contractor. But it does create a situation where if you want to have a business that is as flexible in its ability to use different forms of talent, right? And you would do that for a competitive advantage, you would need to have a seamless way to be able to engage in different forms of talent, whether it's a full-time, part-time, contractor, whatever it might be, automation, and really balancing the overall talent that an organization needs to employ will be, will be more and more part of the conversation going forward, undoubtedly.
Yeah, so as you were talking, it seems like there are like at least two sort of structural issues, I think, that get in the way of disclosures. One is legal, and just sort of and I'm a lawyer, and it's what I do, so I think about that. But like, there is sort of a concern that, you know, if you start to make disclosures about this broader set of your workforce, like, what does that mean? What are you sort of opening yourselves up to? You know, I think ideally I'd love to see some sort of, I don't know, safe harbor that would allow for companies to do good for workers without sort of exposing themselves to legal risk. And we've made some sort of legal arguments on that point. I think the other one is kind of more of an operational structural issue, which is, you know, this would require reporting to a certain degree from your suppliers into your, you know, sort of whatever. And so I think it's a complicated question. Disclosures are just kind of like a complicated question, particularly like you may not have, you know, so oftentimes we're seeing a lot more on like demographic data. You know, your first step might be how many, but then that's only so satisfying, right? Then it's going to be the next question is like, what are the demographics? What are the types of jobs? And so there's just a complicated structural question of like, how do you get that information from one place to another? You certainly will know it for some people, right? Like you may have something like badge data or something for people who are badging in, but you know, you may have other parts of your organization where it's not it's not, people aren't operating that way. And so
Right.
it's just another sort of like, as you were talking, I was just kind of like, ooh, that's a tricky one to like, like as
Yeah.
you like, okay, well, we might need to get there at some point, but like, give me a minute, because it's going to take us some time, with a
Oh,
complex
yeah.
matrixed organization,
Very, very much so. And I'm glad you kind of bring that point, because it is you were talking about kind of operationally, it's a systems issue, right? Ultimately, right? And it's even to be able to have that view to report, much earlier in that conversation is someone being able to go into their, a business manager, whatever, being able to go into their HRIS and see kind of what the size and scope and skills are of their extended workforce. That's a big, I agree, Teresa. I mean, that's a big lift. And when we're talking with clients about this, the concern that they share, certainly there is a whole set, as it comes to the legal side, absolutely, I'm not dismissing it at all, it is honestly the primary driver of concern. But the secondary one is, you're asking these questions on human capital disclosure, Patrick, right? But even if we take a couple of steps back, boy, you asked a really good question of what value are we getting from our extended workforce? And I hate to say they don't know what do they do here, right? You'll know them in bits and pieces in terms of contracts and whatnot, but if you were to roll it up to an entire business unit, it's a very challenging question
Yep,
to
the sort of
figure
like,
out.
yeah, that strategic workforce planning conversation,
Yep,
right? Like,
that's exactly
do
right.
you understand where and why and how you're using the various people? Like,
That's
are
right.
you making a principled decision, or are you making a moment in time sort of, I need somebody, and this is the
Right.
fastest way.
Yeah,
And that's just sort of the reality of how a lot of businesses happen.
totally,
And
totally. And oh, sorry, go ahead, Patrick.
go ahead, please, Tauseef.
I could talk for forever. Go ahead.
I was just going to say, it seems like to those questions you're both asking of, how can a business answer questions of what is the strategic, plan around these workers, or what is the value, is that to answer that, the decisions need to kind of be made and exist in the correct department, right? So with HR, perhaps, right? Potentially to think about how does this workforce complement our other strategies around employees. And it seems like through some of the conversations Just Capital is having is that a lot of times decisions around hiring of contractors is not living in HR. And so I imagine that just operationally, it would be difficult sometimes internally for these two streams to actually connect to answer the questions that you both are asking, because the contract with a vendor is, looking on a ledger more like the ordering of more paper rather than what it is, which is the management of human capital.
I think that's right. And some of the reason for that is legal, right? I mean, companies very specifically divided that out to say, no, we don't treat them like our employees, because the Microsoft Viscano case told us that we should not treat them like our employees. And so, it is one of these sort of interesting, like, legal structural issues where it's like, is this the right thing to do for the workers? On the other hand, part of that is around like, well, are you actually treating them like full-time employees? And if you are, you should be treating them like full-time employees. And so it's a really tricky balance trying to figure out the right places to kind of pull people into systems, pull people into broad decisions, treat people well, do the right thing, and then sort of recognize that some of it isn't and shouldn't be in your control, right? And so where is sort of the principled place to make those decisions about what should or shouldn't be in your control as the sort of employer and procurer of supplied people? That's a terrible, terrible phrase. Don't use that one.
Well,
Contractors.
it sounds like there definitely is a lot to balance, but Microsoft is doing a great job of juggling all of these different considerations. And just want to remind folks who are listening, if you do have questions yourself, please drop them in the chat here. But would love, as we kind of start wrapping up, both of your kind of take and prediction of where are things going. I think there are conversations happening, of course, how more broadly of how is COVID going to change the world of work writ large, right? Are we going to shift to everyone's working from home where possible? Our office is going to start looking differently. And so taking that lens, but narrowing it down specifically to the contract workforce, how do you envision this pandemic impacting businesses, both use of contract workers, but also the structures and management of those workforces?
So I can think of a couple. I mean, one, I think thinking about kind of in the occupational safety and health field, really being very, I mean, kind of thinking back to what I said about sick people in your workplace, to the extent a company is rolling out a testing strategy, COVID testing strategy, or a vaccination testing strategy, it's likely in the company's best interest to consider its contract workforce kind of in the kind of broad collection of how it offers that. It gets complicated with benefits plans and how you characterize all these things, but I think that's an initial stage. And I think it could impact kind of company policies around who gets space in offices, right? Like if you're really thinking about kind of social distancing and like the very practical realities of like, what does your space look like? What do you sort of think about as the space of the future? It's one of the sort of easier things you could do is to say, we are saving the seats in the office for the full-time workforce. So I think that's interesting. I wonder, there's a lot of talk about like, will companies become sort of less campus driven and more kind of like truly everybody works from home, especially kind of tech companies. That is going to have an impact on a lot of the people who work on campuses, right? And so it's not going to be us, although we'll allow some people to work from home some of the time. But that's going to have some sort of ripple impact, I think. I would love for this to give us all some better sort of social safety net legal protections kind of in the world. This pandemic has really, really exposed the holes in the social safety net and the inequality in the system. And so I think that would sort of be my like, hey, wouldn't it be awesome if, we got some great legislation to protect workers here? But, whether that's like pie in the sky, too aspirational, I don't know.
Well, Just Capital is all about changing the entire form of capitalism. So don't worry, it's not too pie.
The entire form of capitalism.
Yeah, so you're in good company to dream big. Tauseef, curious if you have any thoughts on where things are going and how COVID will impact the contract workers.
Yeah, sure. And I mentioned this a little bit earlier, right? I think the acceleration towards flexibility in multiple forms, right? We've talked certainly a lot as a society about the physical location flexibility, the where aspect of it. There's always been the question of the when part. I think the flexibility in type of employment will become something a little bit more prevalent, because I think what has been immovable has been maybe not immovable, but I think it's been a little bit less talked about, is things like, are there different ways to be, and I don't want to use the legal definition, I don't mean the legal form of employee, but basically work for a company, right? Usually it was like you apply and you have this full-time job and 80%, or if you're part-time, you're almost treated like a second-class citizen. Like we existed in this world where your goal was to get a full-time job, and then we had gig workers come up, right, with Uber, Lyft, you name it. And those are two very stark examples, but it's really, those are just points on a continuum. And I see post-COVID that continuum will be filled. It'll make folks like Teresa's job probably a little bit more complicated, figuring out where to draw the lines between certain forms of employment. But we're at very early stages, right? I mean, where we think, well, the alternative here is to go work for one of those apps or to go work full-time at Microsoft, right? Or part-time somewhere else. There's a lot in between. And it's a multi-dimensional continuum, because it's not just the question of where and when, but what's the nature of the employment? Is it, full time, over 12 years? Is it short term? All of these things will become more and more part of conversation. And Patrick, to your point, not just a conversation for lower wage, lower skill work. It will become an increasingly important part of the conversation as folks work longer, live longer, rethink retirement, retire the idea of retirement, right? And this idea of full-time employment or bust will probably go away.
Absolutely, lots to think about as we enter 2021 for sure, and beyond that. I just want to thank both of you so much again for joining us today. for a really exciting and dynamic conversation. For those listening, if you would like to engage Just Capital further on this topic, please get in touch with us at Corp Engage at Just Capital. Happy to always set up a one-on-one call with you to continue our research on the topic and how we can engage your company. So with that, thank you again, Teresa and Tauseef, and hope everyone has a great rest of the year and a safe new year.
Thanks, Patrick. This is great.
Thanks,
Thank you.
Bye, folks.
Bye.